Right, I'm going to make a start. Welcome, everyone. If you're here to talk about the power of disruption in public services, then you're in the right place. I'm Andrew Laird. I'm the Managing Director of Mutual Ventures. We're a public service consultancy that works with councils and with NHS organisations and central government to try and make public services better, more sustainable and more connected to communities. I've got two amazing guests with me today. First up, it's Donna Hall, who is the former Chief Executive of Wigan and now sits on various boards, including the amazing social enterprise Possibilities and also New Local. And then also Chris Wright, who is, up until very recently, was the Chief Executive of Catch 22 and also sits on a number of boards, including Catalyst Choices and Jobs 22. And both Chris and Donna also have NHS board experience as well. And both of them have been guests on my Radical Reformers podcast. So if you want to hear about their experiences in a bit more detail, please go and join there. So Chris and Donna, a very warm welcome. So,
thanks, Andrew. Nice to see you all.
Great, thank you, Donna. So just a little bit of housekeeping. This is being recorded, so there's no need to take copious notes or anything like that, and it will be made available afterwards. You can post questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. I'm sure by this stage everyone is very familiar with that. The format of it will be is that I'm going to do a very short presentation, and then Donna, Chris and I will get into a conversation, and if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A and I will keep an eye on that. So let's get started. The first thing to say is that positive disruption in public services is extremely important. Public services need to evolve and reform, and the only real way to do that is to allow for some disruption. But disruption can be done well and it can be done badly. And my presentation will be a case study, and the case study is around Trussonomics. So everybody by now, I think, will know what Trussonomics was. Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss saw themselves as disruptors. They had a plan, but the timing, the circumstance, the content, the legitimacy and the execution of it were all wrong. So the question is, what lessons can we learn from that? And it was so easy to find little pictures and cartoons and things, so I felt like I had to include a couple of them. But I've been thinking about this and wrote an article on it, and I think that there are some very important lessons that disruptors who want to make a really positive impact can learn from the experience of Trussonomics. So first up is really tackling it head on, and that is to show some respect for the existing orthodoxy. Now, this word orthodoxy, I feel, has been misused a bit, actually. So Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng positioned themselves as being completely against the orthodoxy. So by that, they meant the Office of Budget Responsibility, the Treasury and the Bank of England. And you'll see there in the two pictures, that's poor old Tom Scholar, who Kwasi Kwarteng sacked as the permanent secretary of the Treasury in his first day. And he was very much presented as the face of orthodoxy. But orthodoxy isn't just, or it's not a counterposition to disruption. I think orthodoxy in many ways is the culmination of learning experience over a very long period of time and by a very large number of people. And orthodoxy today really actually includes a lot of the successful disruption from the past. So that's not to say that orthodoxy shouldn't be challenged, but a disruption that rubbishes everything that has gone before will not take hold, in my opinion. So the second lesson is all about timing and circumstance. So in comedy and sport, and as it turns out, in a major reversal of economics strategy, timing is everything. We're in the middle, we were and still are in the middle of a cost of living crisis. The markets were already twitchy after 2 years of large amounts of borrowing and spending during the pandemic. So the timing of what Liz and Kwasi were trying to do was all wrong. You have to be aware that there are other things going on in the world apart from the thing that you're trying to achieve, regardless of the content of it. And your disruption, whatever it is, has to fit with the prevailing challenges of the day, which when you look back at Trussonomics, that did not appear to be addressing the really important things that people were facing. Next lesson is to think about capacity. So in many respects and in many circumstances, capacity is a zero-sum game. If you ask people to do something, they will quite often not be able to do something else. So if you consider the poor civil servants in HMRC with all of those new tax ideas, if you take the example of the national insurance changes or health and care levy, it was in, it was out, people were working on it behind the scenes, and all of that meant that they were not doing other things as well. So disruption's great, but you will be asking people to do things that will take their time away from other things. So just be very mindful of that as well. And this is my view. I think that disruption has to have a moral justification. So you have to ask yourself this question: is it morally justified? And if it is, I think you've actually got the beginnings of an answer to most questions about your disruption. And in public services, it should really be in response to a real problem that the person on the street is experiencing. And in my view, it shouldn't be ideological. That isn't necessarily grounded in a moral justification. And I think if you're asking yourself, does this feel like the right thing to do given what everyone is going through at the minute, then that's always a really good start. Then there's the question of legitimacy. So make sure you are or have a legitimate messenger for it. So in terms of Trussonomics, one of the key problems that a lot of people had wasn't necessarily the content, and the content was very questionable. We've already talked about that, but it was the fact that Liz Truss was elected by less than 100,000 people and was attempting to use that as a mandate to make a huge change, which went pretty much directly against a lot of what was in the 2019 manifesto, which did have political legitimacy. And there was zero effort made to win hearts and minds and to try and make it a shared endeavor between people, even a small group of people within Parliament. It just didn't seem, that effort didn't seem to be there. So when you're thinking about being a legitimate messenger, I put a picture of David Attenborough up there because when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, you know, I would trust anything that he says. And when he's talking about his topic, you really listen because there's such a long period of time where he's been a trusted voice there. So legitimacy in public services comes in all shapes and forms. There can be democratic mandate. You can be a professional with deep experience and have real credibility that you really understand your topic, or you could be someone who has experienced public services and has been a service user, perhaps, who has lived through it. In much of the work we do, having that authentic voice of somebody who's really experienced public services is a really legitimate messenger. And then finally, it's the whole point of doing groundwork. So that's a picture of the famous pitch rolling that you hear about. This is a cricket pitch, and very hard to play cricket on a pitch that isn't rolled. But when we talk about groundwork and we think about Trussonomics, I mean, even being prepared to answer basic questions about what you're proposing to try and anticipate challenges. Generally speaking, people do not like surprises, particularly nasty surprises. So it's really important to, as you're approaching a disruption, to engage, to discuss, to try and convince, and at least try and get some key people bought into what you're trying to achieve. And I think when you think back over all of those points, the whole Trussonomics project really didn't address any of them very convincingly. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so I can bring Donna and Chris into the conversation. So Donna, if I could start with you, do you agree with that list? And is there anything there that's missing, do you think?
Yeah, I think just a couple of things that I think maybe they're subsets of what you've already said, Andrew, but I think you've really hit the nail on the head with all of those things. The other two that I would add, the first one is purpose. What is the purpose of government? Yeah. The reason you trust David Attenborough is it's very clear what his purpose is. Yeah. And it's very embedded. I think they didn't really understand the role of government or the civil service. And I think that's really when we're thinking about transforming public services, we've got to think about in a place, in a community, what is the role of public services? What function do they perform? Are they there to enable and facilitate change, working with citizens in different ways, or are they there to provide top-down transactional services in the NHS or in local government or housing or whatever it is? So purpose is one. And I think secondly, culture. What kind of culture do you want to create? What kind of relationships do you want to create between civil servants and government, and between citizens and government? And all of that was missing, wasn't it? It was based on a flawed theory that was written 5 years ago, Britannia Unchained, and they hadn't updated it to reflect the changes from when it was written. So yeah, bang on.
I think those are two excellent ones, Donna. Thank you very much. And I mean, you say a flawed theory from 5 years ago. I mean, I'm not sure it's ever been positively proven in a country to work the way the theory suggests it might. So it's really helpful. Thank you. Chris, the same question to you. What do you think of that list? And are there things missing?
Thanks, Andrew. Well, look, I think your analysis is spot on as well. I was actually, because we had advanced sight of your slides, and it made me actually challenge some of my own assumptions about the use of language. And so you use words like disruptor and challenging the orthodoxy, and I've tended to use that language myself. And actually, you've got to be really careful about use of loose language without actually really appreciating what you mean by it. So I think you pointed to a number of really important foundations in any kind of any argument about how you shift the system has to be based on some real kind of, as you say, moral justification for why you want to do that. And as Donna just said, the thing around culture is fundamental. What is it we're trying to do? What legitimacy, what credentials have we got to suggest it can be done differently? And I'm really interested in a lot of things that we probably believe should be done, and not necessarily new things. They're things that we've done well before, but we might have lost sight of how we do them, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I'm always I've become a bit skeptical about innovation as just the use of the word innovation, as though everything's a zero sum. We have to start from nothing and build up again. Whereas actually what you've kind of highlighted is a lot of the reason we are where we are is because we built on some brilliant developments of the past. And we mustn't forget what we already know. And I sometimes worry that in our desire to be disruptive, we forget about some of the kind of fundamental, basic kind of approaches to the way we organize ourselves around the delivery of public services in particular.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder, is there a better word than orthodoxy? Because, I think that a point I would also make is that there are forces that resist change for this, just because that, so this is not to give a free pass that any obstruction to change is somehow rooted in the moral protection of all the good stuff that's gone before. Maybe there is a different word. I mean, so what do you both feel about the orthodoxy versus disruption question. Donna, what do you think about that? I mean, because there is, I will ask you for a really good example in a second of a positive disruption, but as someone who has tried to change public services from within the public sector, what's your gut feel when you hear that kind of disruption versus orthodoxy line being drawn?
Yeah, can I approach the question from a slightly different,
Sure.
being disruptive,
Yeah.
approach the question from a slightly
Perfect.
different angle. I think we've got to step back, and it's not a kind of binary choice between disruption or orthodoxy, definitely, as you've said. And I know you're not claiming that, Andrew, but I think it's just looking at the state of public services at the moment, and from a helicopter view, and the underinvestment that we've had for the last 12 years that has crippled them, absolutely crippled them, and I'm really, really worried about their survival, and certainly local government survival into the future. And my background is obviously from that angle. But having said that, I think the other thing is, and that's not being political, that's just fact. You look at the amount of money that's come out to public services in the last 12 years, it's huge. And the fact we've not trained enough people, and Brexit, we've just not got the people to do the kind of model. Turning to the model was created in the 1940s, wasn't it? As Hilary Cotton points out in Radical Help. Yeah. Creation of beverage and the welfare state. It was created in a 1940s factory model, top down, like a production line model, and that's what people knew at that time. But it wasn't reflective of the way people live their lives, and it certainly isn't reflective all these years later. So I think, but we still have that at its core, plus the civil service and the government and the political dimensions of the two houses. They were created in a different time, and we've never disrupted that, have we? We've never really taken a good hard look at that. So I do think there needs to be, at that very macro level, a really hard look at the effectiveness of all of that. In the NHS, regularly it's changed, isn't it? I would say every 5 years, maybe even less, we create something new. But what we don't change is fundamentally the underlying model around public services and the transactional nature of them. You will get this and you'll be grateful for it. This is what we provide. So rather than a person-centered approach around people and professionals working together around the person and supporting them to live the best life, we have this incredible, I always use the example of my mum in every seminar at the moment. 22 different people came to see her when she came out of hospital on one day, on one morning. They came up the drive, 22 different bits of health and social care came to see her, all jumbled up in the wrong order. None of them asked her about the support she had from family, friends, neighbours, what she liked to do, who she was as a person. And, I think we evaluated that in Wigan, the work we did with Hilary, £250,000 per year per family, to by the end of the year, have them in the same situation as they were at the beginning. And all we'd done is assess them and referred them multiple times in that year to different bits of the system without actually supporting them. So we do need disruption, but I think it should start with the macro level. And you can do that as a leader within a council or as a frontline person within a council. We set up what we call a Rebel Alliance in all organisations I work with. People who've got that appetite and that, really want to help and support people in a different way. Yeah. So sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, it's great. I've actually got my Rebel Alliance mug. My Star Wars mug there, so I don't know whether that gave you the idea.
That's fantastic. I didn't see that.
No, it's about disruption. Actually, I guess the Rebel Alliance. If I could just ask Donna as a follow-up question there, so that I totally agree that the model of government needs to be seriously looked at, but and there's no easy answer to this, so just be good to get your thoughts, but how do leaders, particularly politicians at a local or national level, find the space to really upend things and look at things when there's the 24-hour news cycle? Everything seems to be about, and this, I blame Boris Johnson a lot for this, everything seems to be about getting through the next 5 minutes and just saying whatever gets you out of a situation. I mean, how do we get the leaders we need who are prepared to say, this is going to take possibly more than one parliament to fix, and you're not going to see everything coming tomorrow? I just really struggle with this.
I think a lot of the leaders I'm working with in integrated care systems and within the NHS and local government are kind of, I know it sounds awful to say it, but they're ignoring the government and they're just getting on with stuff at the local level with local people. So there's so much good stuff going on around community wealth building, citizen engagement, a different way of thinking about the future. I've just been on a session with Rob Webster from West Yorkshire and Harrogate Integrated Care System, and I know he's one of you. He's one of your guests.
Also a podcast guest. Also
he's one of your guests. But some of the stuff he's doing. So I asked him, "How are you preparing your 5-year strategy?" So he's basically ignoring NHS England and all the plans, and he's basically saying, right, I'm going to work with citizens locally in West Yorkshire and Harrogate. The way we're producing our strategy is different. So they've invited 120 system players to bring another person with them, a citizen with them, to a session where they've completely rewritten their strategy based on what citizens want from the system and what the demands and pressures are in the system, rather than it being about Objective 27 is to do, very NHS target driven, top down, paternalistic. It's driven bottom up from neighbourhood, from place. Yeah. And I think that's where local government and NHS trusts and others come into their own, really, because they've got that local agenda, they've got that mandate from local people. And you always have a rebel alliance, if not more than one, in a council.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just, Chris, before I bring you in here, just we're observing as well that civil servants in central government are finding ways to keep everything moving in amidst the chaos of the political forum at the minute, and are finding ways to keep doing all the important work that they do, and thinking about what really needs ministerial approval, what doesn't, that type of thing, just to keep things moving. And they're responding in a very similar way. Chris, can I bring you in as well, just to either respond to some of the things Donna said, or just to talk about that question of orthodoxy versus disruption?
Thanks, Ed. I could listen to Donna all day, because I think everything she said I fully agree with. I wrote a piece a couple of months ago for NPC on actually the post-war settlement and thinking differently about the building blocks that we built our welfare state on, and the need actually to think differently about the conditions that we are now in, which need different kind of responses. And I I've been in and around the public system for 38, 40 years, and I trained as a social worker because I believed that social work was a radical solution to people's challenges. It was all about giving people agency to be able to take control of their own circumstances, and I just want to pick up on that, the take back control mantra, the Brexit debate. And I think that resonated with people very powerfully, because people feel that they don't have any control over their own circumstances or over their own lives. And that's largely as a consequence of people who come into contact with the public system, because of exactly what Donna said around it's very transactional, it's very top down, it's bureaucratic. I'm now on an NHS board, and I'm fascinated by the important focus on assurance, but at the expense of what? And whether we spend all our time assuring ourselves that we're doing things right. And Eileen Munro, in her report around child protection, she talked about social workers spending their time doing things right as opposed to doing the right thing. And I'm really interested in how we've ended up responding to a bureaucratic constraints with a view that that's the way that we'll end up being able to deliver better services, and it patently isn't the case. And this is very partial, but having spent the last 16 years in a social business, I'm really interested in the kind of vehicles that you create in order to organise the delivery of public services, and I kind of started to develop some thinking around whether an entrepreneurial mindset is more suited to delivering social impact than a bureaucratic mindset, which is often designed to protect the interest of the producer at the expense of those who are receiving services. So we can get back to your question around orthodoxy or disruption. I think in a way it's almost irrelevant. What we need to be doing is evolving the way we organize ourselves in order to provide services which meet the needs of those who use them, but also are responsive and listen. And one of the things I've become very concerned about is just the professional arrogance of many in public service who believe that they're right, and the people who receive the services, haven't got a clue about what it is they need. And for most people who don't necessarily interact with public services, you probably don't really appreciate it. But if you think about trying to get a GP's appointment, or the way you perceive that you might be being spoken to, many of us who might be articulate and eloquent and all those things, confident, all come against these kind of experiences where you can feel as though you're asking for something which actually you're not really entitled to. And so I think that feeds into Donna's point around culture, around what the words I'm interested in are. I'm fascinated by trust. I'm fascinated by reciprocity. I think we've lost sight of the relational, all at the expense of things being very transactional and top down. So I don't know if you can pick some bones from that, but there's a lot for us to play with, I think, and go for.
There is, Chris. There's a few things there. I mean, but knowing you, I can imagine you having limited tolerance for a board that spends all its time focusing on not making mistakes rather than really pushing things. So, interestingly, some of the work I did 5-10 years ago now around supporting public services to spin out into social enterprises. There was a lot of that in health and care. Donna and I both sit on the board of Possibilities, which was one of those organizations that used to be within a council. It now delivers adult social care from a social enterprise environment. Not Possibilities. I mean, Donna does a fantastic job making sure that we're really focused on being entrepreneurial, I think. But for some of the other spin-outs, as they were called, they had to do quite a bit of work with their boards to get the mindset away from just assurance and not making mistakes and just making sure that the risk registers were in line and that everybody's back was covered, to actually, right, we actually want you to bring ideas to the board meeting. And there's quite a lot of challenge there, I think. And then just finally, Chris, your point around what I would call the lay voice being impactful in the delivery of public services. I think you're right. There is a lot of, I think you call it professional arrogance or something. I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but that does happen. And, I think involving people in their own care and decisions is really important. And it takes a bit of time, but ultimately probably leads to a better outcome for a person as well. So that point I certainly heard loud and clear. What I'd really like to do now is to talk about some examples of this, and examples of where you've seen disruption work well, and equally importantly, examples of where it hasn't worked so well. Donna, can I come to you first? Because I can think of a couple of yours immediately, but I'll let you choose which ones you should.
They're probably the ones that didn't go so well, Andrew, and there've been many of those.
Good.
Many of those. So can I pick, not the Wigan deal, because obviously that's talked about a lot, but just an element of it that I think was really did make a big difference. to citizens, and still does today. Because I think you're right, the chopping and changing of strategy every 5 minutes with ministers moving on. And what the King's Fund said about the deal was it was clarity of purpose that made it different to other approaches, and then constancy of purpose. So it outlived the leadership at that time. It was something that was there for perpetuity for the place. So, and that's the benefit, the beauty of local government and NHS trusts and housing associations, others, is they're focused on place, not just on airy-fairy strategy. They're focused on real people living in real communities. And that gives us real power, I think, and real strength. So one of them I was going to mention that went well was an element of the deal called the Community Investment Fund, which was really great. So it was 13 million in a time when we're cutting everything else because we had 160 million to save. We started to build a different relationship with the community and voluntary sector in the borough. There was one previously of distrust there, where basically we wouldn't give very much, but we would micromanage it to within an inch of its life, stifle all the creativity, and we would have a really hefty contract in place, which we were probably spending more monitoring on its implementation rather than they were actually giving to the group, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So we turned the relationship on its head and said, right, tell us in local areas what is needed. And then rather than having a top-down commissioning strategy, we'll have a bottom-up approach where local people and local community and voluntary groups tell us what is needed, and then we will fund it to the tune of 13 million, putting resources into things that we would never have thought of, sat in a town hall. So, things like walking football, a rugby memories group for people with dementia, things that were very specific to Wigan. And the relationship just blossomed and went from strength to strength. I remember in the council chamber, a couple of councillors saying, they'll run away with the money. You can't do that. You can't just give, because we didn't have contracts in place that were like that. They were very loose and very open and very much outcome focused. They were longer term rather than just giving somebody some money for a year. It was like, here's some money for 5 years, go and do remarkable stuff in your local area. And we found that the return on investment was huge. So we managed to add through doing that. And I don't think it was the public services changing that did this. I think it was the investment in the social infrastructure. Yeah. We added an additional 7 years of healthy life expectancy in the most deprived wards.
Fantastic. That's a really good example, Donna. If I could just ask, how did you make sure that the elements of the Wigan deal had longevity across, different council leaders, different chief execs even? So one of my colleagues, John Copps, when we were talking about all of this in the company, was just saying about a really important thing about disruption is to keep making the case and make it sustainable, because sometimes, and I think we saw a bit of this with Boris Johnson, that there'd be a flurry of activity around something and then the circus would move on to the next thing and actually it would never get implemented. How did you embed it?
I think the first thing is ban projects and have that overarching strategic narrative, and that's what the deal was. It was simple, it was clear, it was on one piece of paper. It was absolutely embedded in everyone's terminology. We didn't do projects, we had this strategic framework, and then within it we had behaviours, and I think the values and behaviours are at the heart of the culture shift that Chris talked about and you've talked about. That we had to part company with people who didn't believe in trusting citizens, for example, on the management team. There were some people who were very risk averse in the way that Chris described around assurance. They didn't want to get stuck into really remodeling what they did. It was very much around, this is fine, I'll just walk around with my clipboard and assure myself everything's okay. And I think modern leaders need to be much braver and much more courageous, and they need to be bold, not in the Trussonomics daft European Research Group way, personal view, but in a really citizen informed, citizen driven. We are public, we serve the public as public servants, and keep reminding ourselves of that. And that relationship with citizens is really vital. So I think it's picking leaders, other leaders who are like that, to drive the change. You've got that appetite for risk, for changing things, because I think we are in danger of falling off the cliff of public services if we don't do some type of disruption, you know. And it's got to be fundamentally, what is our purpose? What is our role in our local community? Asking ourselves that, giving the freedom and permission to innovate, frontline. I know you don't like that word, Chris, but to try new things in integrated neighbourhood teams, because people are scared of trying new things, you know. So that's one element of it. Shall I say something that didn't work?
Well, if I can come back to you on that,
of course.
Donna, we'll get Chris's thoughts on something which worked, and then I was going to remind you that I will be coming back to you to ask you about something which didn't work. So, Chris, do you want to share some thoughts on disruptions?
I've probably got more examples of things that didn't work, but I think
we've got time for that.
One of the things, and this is quite a macro level, but one of the things I kind of stumbled across but realized was really important was when I was running Catch 22, it was about culture, and it was kind of changing the mindset about the kind of organization we were and we wanted to be. And, you know, I said earlier that I've become a very strong advocate of the need for other kind of providers in the public space, but to rethink what outsourcing is. Outsourcing, you know, big government procurement isn't the answer to the issues that we've been touching on this morning. I think we need to find ways of unlocking capacity in communities and in localities to actually deliver and be part of the ecosystem for providing services for people. But in order to get there, you've got to kind of shift mindset and shift thinking. And so one of the things we tried to do was move away from a kind of traditional charity model to starting to think much more. I used the phrase earlier about being a social business, and to be honest about what you need to function as an organization. That means you've got to be prepared to make a profit. But the profit's not to be extracted, but it's for redistribution back into the purpose you're there for. And it's possible to do these things. And in the, you know, the charity world, people speak very quaintly about surplus. And, you know, I think it just kind of it misses the point. We've got to focus on, if you're going to run an organization, you've got to run it efficiently, effectively. You've got to apply some business acumen, but for the purpose of delivering a social impact. And I'm fascinated by that. And I'm not saying we've got it absolutely right, but we went on a very explicit journey to try and shift the mindset in the organization from one which was all about doing good. And there's nothing wrong in doing good. That's what we're about. But not making the assumption that just by doing you are doing good. But to one where you can demonstrate that you've got the competence, capability, credentials, and ability to deliver high quality services to people who need them. So that's one thing, you know, just shifting mindset and thinking differently about organizational structure.
Chris, before you go on there, can I just ask about how because it's all very well you shifting your mindset, you're only one side of the equation. There's a commissioner there as well. How do you get their mindset in the same place?
And it's very difficult. And look, Donna will know this better than many, but you know, commissioners come in lots of different guises, don't they? But procurement can get in the way. There's all kinds of obstacles. So I think you've just got to find ways of constantly getting into a conversation. Try and get into conversations, demonstrate what works. Also recognize that, you know, a lot of we were a provider. A lot of tenders are heavily specified to the point where actually does it really matter who the provider is, because it's so controlled. So you have to then work within the constraints that are imposed on you. You can't, in order to play in the game, you've got to get into the game, and then you're in it, and then you might be able to get into conversations, be much better at capturing evidence and data, and then trying to use the data and the evidence to develop insight, which you then might be able to try and influence how commissioners think. And look, this is not easy. It's very contingent on relationships and beliefs, and there are some people who still think that organizations like my old organization are there to provide additionality. I think we're there to provide core public service delivery in a very kind of enterprising and effective way.
And so have you had success working with commissioners to turn what we might regard as a traditional outputs contract into something that fits more with what you're expressing?
I think variable, it's hard. It's hard because you're pushing against the grain, really. You're pushing against procurement. So you have to do it by building coalitions, organizations like yours, Andrew. There are other networks of social enterprises who constantly are trying to have a debate about how you can have this, how you can try and encourage different kind of thinking. There was some procurement regulations within the old European legislation which were very conducive to this, which and people like Julian Blake who've been arguing very strongly around public procurement being much more conducive to the type of model I'm talking about. So look, that's a very long-winded way of saying no.
Well, no, I think you've had more success than you maybe realize, because I'm obviously familiar with your work and a lot of the things that the Catch-22 do, and I think Donna will know this very well as well. I mean, I keep mentioning possibilities. I'm going to mention them again. The chief exec there, Rachel Law, is really good at building relationships with commissioners and helping shape what comes next. And I think you guys at Catch-22 were really good at that as well.
I think so. And look, one of the other things I was going to talk about two other things quickly. One is a thing I'm very proud of, that we helped to create capacity in the Liverpool City region, which is busy doing some really interesting work across this whole kind of spectrum.
This is children's residential care.
Capacity more broadly around public service reform, and then specifically Juno, which is our approach to rethinking how children's residential care can be provided, and to break the monopoly of, the 70% monopoly of private equity funded residential children's homes. Anything, look, private equity has a place, but I don't think it has a place in residential children's care homes, because it's essentially about extracting value. And if you're extracting value, you're only taking it away from one person, i.e. the user.
Yeah, thank you. Donna, I'm going to come back to you now to give us your example of what didn't work, because this is where a lot of the lessons are.
First, can I just say I totally agree with Chris around extracting wealth from service users in children's services. It's got to change that. It definitely has. So there are so many, I don't know where to start with things I've tried that I think the main one, it's not just one thing, it's more my approach. When I first started as a chief exec, I was a bit nervous, like most leaders are when they first start in a role. I didn't quite know what my purpose was, and I didn't also really know who to trust and what to challenge and what not to challenge. And I think I remember once speaking to another chief exec who's an absolutely inspirational guy, and he said to me, the main job of a chief exec is triangulation. And it's basically just checking that what you're being told is right. It's actually bearing out in the experience of people using services and staff. It's triangulating and checking that that's right, and that creating that cultural tone for a place. So, and how you do that, it really varies from organisation to organisation. But I believe too much what I was told by leaders. I'm not saying which organisation, leaders in particularly in social care, both adults and children, being told that if they were asked to do anything different, people would die, and that there wasn't any appetite for any risk at all.
Yeah.
And that they were very much led by national systems, by Ofsted and by CQC, and that they couldn't change that. They didn't have the permission to change that. That we had to introduce, whenever we had a budget cut to make, we had to introduce new eligibility criteria. That was the only way. Or put council tax up to the maximum. That was the only way. So we froze it for 8 years in Wigan, and as a result, I think we really thought differently about the services we provided and our purpose. And I think that's what organisations need to do. And I don't know if you've seen some brilliant work going on in Gateshead on eligibility criteria, but there's a guy called Mark. Oh, he'd be a great person to interview for your radical reformers, Andrew. I can put you in touch with him. Mark Adam Smith, and he's head of public service reform in Gateshead Council. He's doing some amazing stuff they've removed eligibility criteria for all sorts of things, and they're having proper human to human conversations with people, rather than just putting them through the mill of assessing them for certain services that we think people want, and then telling them they're not bad enough to access them yet. For example,
I'd be fascinated to know how he got that done, and got the finance director to sign off on it.
He's amazing. He is amazing. And he's, one example is, so when people have missed a payment on the council tax, rather than sending them a nasty letter and a bailiff's letter, they ring them up and say, can I help you? Is there anything we can do to help you and support you? Yeah. It's that different mindset and mentality. It's not an enforcer role. Their purpose isn't to enforce criteria. It's to try and help and support people in a different way, a human way.
I think that's fantastic. It's that's a really fantastic suggestion, and just that is one of the things I'm really interested in, is how you go on that change journey, because it always feels, as you say, that there will be people saying, well, you can't do that, or you can't do it because of the impact in the short term, rather than letting it go long term. Chris, same question to you. Have you got any good examples of where things haven't worked and what you learned from them?
Yeah, I've got a few examples in terms of some social enterprise ideas we've set up, which just basically were so far out with our kind of experience that although they might have been good ideas, we just didn't have the capability to do that. So at one point I was running a garage business, running retail MOTs and service, and you thought, yeah, this is a great idea. And the idea was to employ young people as the mechanics, and but we just couldn't make it work, because we didn't have enough capital to dilute the overhead by having enough outlets. So anyway, it was so far removed from my comfort. I don't even know how a car works. So to suddenly be running garages was a kind of a weird thing. Anyway, that's a silly example. But on a more specific, a serious issue around public policy, I think I swallowed the Kool-Aid around free schools and the potential of multi-academy trusts. So I was really interested in the idea of local people being able to run their own services, to be directly involved, accountable, all of those things, to the point where I can remember once sending probably a pretty naive letter to Gove when he was Justice Secretary, suggesting that we could run prisons in a very different way by them becoming locally accountable and so on, using the MAP model. But and forgive me now, Donna, for saying this, but one of the problems around the MAP model was, in my view, is it simply replaces local authority control with the control of the DFE. And I'd much rather have local authority control than the DFE, because it really is the dead hand of bureaucracy, which, in my view, stifles the ability to be entrepreneurial and more responsive to local circumstances.
Yeah,
so I really thought we could do that. We got lots of things wrong in terms of our own inputs as well, and the expertise we had, and I probably sold what I thought we could do, but I also felt that we were very constrained by the whole model. It isn't what it says it is on the tin.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic example, Chris, and we could have a whole other session on how centralized we are as a state and how that needs to change. But I think a really important lesson for everybody from what you described there is, not being afraid to support things, try things that maybe don't work out, but you've got to be ready to change your mind when the learning and the evidence suggests you should. And I think that's really important for a positive disruptor, to have that mindset where you're flexible and you realize that if things don't work or it hasn't worked, that you can shift. There's nothing worse than plowing on. I think that's another lesson from Trussonomics, maybe, adjust as you can see the reaction. But yeah, Chris, I've got one question which has come in here. It's from Alison Hopkins, who is the chief executive of Accelerate Kick, really fantastic chief executive. She was asking, this is in reference to something you said before, can you tell us more about doing everything right rather than doing the right thing in terms of board behaviors? Because she's saying in Accelerate Kick, the board, she's very excited by the fact that they now spend far less time on assurance and more time on good discussion to further the mission and things like that, which Accelerate Kick does a lot of clinical work, so that's quite an achievement.
Yeah, well, look, I think Donna used the word bravery earlier, and I think boards have to be brave and they have to be bold. It doesn't mean they have to be not focused on the important things. These things are not kind of mutually exclusive. It's just the kind of the balance, I think. And so I think it's all about the quality of a board, and you have to invest a lot of effort in building your board and board development and knowing each other, not creating some kind of group mind, but by having a board which is sufficiently confident and comfortable with itself that it can challenge itself and ask the right questions. And it's harder to do in some environments than others, and that's what I'm currently discovering. It's ever so easy for somebody like me to come along and say, oh, there's far too much assurance, but as I've said to some of my colleague execs, for some, for a lot of people, these are career-defining decisions. And if you're in a big bureaucracy and you're seen as some kind of maverick in relation to assurance, then your career is going to be limited. So, our job is trying to create the air cover which allows people to be brave and make decisions. And so I think, as a non-exec, you have to be prepared to believe in what stand over what you believe, and protect the organization so that it can get on and do some really, braver things. Because you very rarely come across organizations which aren't full of brilliant people who want to do brilliant work, who are really committed to what the reason they're there is because they want to make a difference. Our job is to try and create a space which gives them the opportunity to make a difference.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. Donna, we've got a couple of minutes left. I just want to give you an opportunity if you wanted to say anything else or respond to that. If not, that's absolutely fine, but just to give you the chance.
No, it's brilliant. And thanks for organising the seminar, Andrew. I think it's a really important topic. And I think it's certainly the systems I'm working with and the boards I'm on, I think the single biggest thing, if I could just wave a magic wand, if I could have it, is that courageous leadership. It's always, and you can see it in systems that don't perform very well. There's an absence of it. There's very much a kind of, going down the route of this is what we've always done, or we tried that 20 years ago and it won't work. So having leaders with courage and optimism who are citizen focused. And I think you're absolutely right to go over about prison reform, Chris, because I think if there's one area that is the most ripe for radical reform, it's criminal justice system.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's absolutely broken, isn't it? And you look at other models like the Norwegian model, which is much more rehabilitation focused. It works. It's initially more expensive, but in the longer term, it's cheaper because you've got less in and out of prison episodes. You've got more recovery and more community embeddedness. So, I think it's really taking the time. Do you remember the graph of doom that we all looked at a few years back and we saw, oh my God, everything's broken. What did we do about that apart from keep describing the problem? Yeah. So the same person who said triangulation is the job of a chief exec told me that he's sick of people on very high salaries describing the problem in different ways to him.
Just trying to think of which particular graph of doom you mean, Donna. There's a lot of them around.
Do you remember the one that if we did nothing for 10 years, which most people did, by the way, then we'd end up in a crisis, and we're in a crisis.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Let's stop describing the problem and start doing something about it.
Quite right. And on that note, Chris and Donna, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed that. I think everybody else will too. Just a reminder to those to those listening, it's recorded. We will send the link out. We actually get many more times, many more people watching in their own time the recording than actually attending. So please do share it far and wide. I think this is important stuff that everybody needs to hear. So Chris and Donna, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for doing it.